Ever wonder what psychologists talk about over coffee? I'm Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, where I specialize in rehab and health psychology and acceptance and commitment therapy.
And I'm Diana Hill, a clinical psychologist in Seaside, Santa Barbara, California, where I specialize in mindfulness and values-based approaches to therapy.
In this podcast, we bring psychology research into practice by discussing topics from psychology with experts in the field and with each other. You'll get a glimpse into the books we read, the research we think is interesting, and the ideas from psychology that we use to thrive in our own lives.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hi, Diana.
Hi, Debbie. It's good to see you today.
It's great to see you, too. We just figured out the other day that this is our 1-year anniversary of doing our podcast. We released our very first episode just about a year ago in November of 2016.
Congratulations. I can't believe we've made it this far, and it's been really fun. Things have changed and evolved since we've started out, but I think we have a nice body of work here, and it's been fun to just be connecting with you regularly and exploring all the topics that we have. So go back and listen to some of our oldies but goodies. What is one of your favorite oldies but goodies?
Oh my gosh. I really that's hard to decide. There's a lot that I really like. I really like the food ones. Those were pretty recent. Mm-hmm. Let me think the old ones. Which ones do you like?
My two favorites are the Hygge and the Habits.
Habits. Yeah, actually, I re-listened to the Habits one recently for another talk I gave, and I was like, that was good. Yeah. Well, and thanks to you, we've done 30. This is our 33rd episode. We've done 32 so far, and also thanks to all of our listeners that have been with us along the way. It's been fun.
So toasting to everyone here on our 1 year, and sort of in line with that, we're wanting to reach out to listeners and hear from you. So we're having a mailbag episode. We'd love for you to send in questions, whether they're questions about psychology in general or about being a psychologist or anything that you're really interested in that you want us either to do some research around or share some personal information around. Send them in. And we are going to be collecting them by November 20th and reading some of them on the air and then answering your questions. You can send them on Facebook or you can connect to us through our website. There's a contact us section there. So send those in by November 20th and we'll read you on the air.
Yeah, it'll be fun. Ask us anything. We may or may not do it on the air, but we probably will. We probably will.
We're just curious. We also just want to hear from you because sometimes it's a one-way show here. So we want to know about the people that are listening to us.
Yeah. So today we have an exciting topic. I have an episode where I interviewed Dr. Yael Schonbrun. She's a frequent contributor to the podcast, and we talked about how partner relationships can change after kids come along. So that's our topic for today. Diana, I want to start by asking you a question. What do you think? Did things change with you and your spouse at all before and after having kids?
Well, yes, of course. Everything gets turned on its head. And certainly in those first years, things really get turned on their heads. And I think one of the things that I've enjoyed most about having kids is how much it has the opportunity to really deepen our relationships. A lot of people talk about the struggles of having kids and, relationships, but actually there's nothing better on the planet than loving something with somebody else and sharing in that. So all the little things that your children do and the developmental milestones that other people could care less about, your spouse really does care about. And so it's nice to share in that and then also learn about each other as parents because a whole nother side shows up. It kind of shows up a little bit when you have a dog of how your spouse is going to parent.
Right. So some of the same issues arise.
Same issues around discipline and follow through.
Right.
But also it's really nice to see how those changes deepen relationships. So it's certainly changed a lot in good ways.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you said that because in this episode, we do focus a little bit on some of the challenges that often come up, and we have some strategies sort of based on the psychology research for folks who might be struggling with this. But I think that it's really important that what you just acknowledged, which is that it also has an opportunity to really be a cool experience to have together. So let me just quickly introduce Yael before we get started. So Dr. Yael Schonbrun is a clinical psychologist. She has a private practice, and one of her areas of specialty is couples work, which is why this is a great episode to do with her. She's also an assistant professor at Brown University, and she's a mom of 3 kids. And she's done a lot of work and writing on balancing family life with work, and she's been published on that topic in the New York Times and Psychology Today and some other places. So you can link to her and her writing on our website, offtheclockpsych.com. And she has a book forthcoming. So very happy that she brought this, this episode together with me.
Great. I'm excited to listen.
This is Debbie Sorensen. I'm very happy today to be talking to our frequent contributor, Yael Schonbrun, who is she's a therapist out on the East Coast and who does a lot of couples work. And so today we're going to be talking about a topic that's near and dear to both of our hearts, which is the topic of how partner and couple relationships sort of change after kids, and we're going to explore some issues that sort of frequently come up for couples in that period, between when a baby comes along and, you have a few young kids. And we're going to provide some research-based suggestions, so kind of a ray of hope for anyone who might be struggling with this right now. Yael, I think this is in fact a topic that has both maybe professional and personal relevance for both of us. Is that fair to say?
Definitely fair to say on my part. Yeah, I, as you said, I do a lot of couples therapy and have done a lot of research in the marital world. And then I'm also a parent to 3 children, the youngest of which just turned 1. And I know from both professional and personal perspectives how challenging it is to navigate relationships after children arrive, especially in the early years when you're sleep deprived and don't have much time to yourself and certainly don't have much time and energy to direct towards your spouse.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have 2 kids, one age 3 and one age 5. So I'm a little bit out of the kind of the immediate baby years, but a couple years ago I was struggling with a few things related to this topic, and a friend of mine recommended a book that we're going to talk about a lot today. It's called And Baby Makes 3 by John Gottman and Julie Gottman, who are psychology researchers who study couples. And a friend recommended the book, and I took a look at it, and I was kind of like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what I'm going through right now. It was just a huge relief, I think, to even just know that I wasn't alone going through some of those challenges. And so I'm actually hoping that this episode today, some of our listeners might feel the same way, like, oh, yeah, there's some familiarity there. Because certainly, even as somebody who, is in this field, I actually feel a little funny even doing this episode with all these suggestions, because I'm like, there's some areas there where I certainly could use some work in my own life.
Oh, for sure. I think it's one of the great ironies of being a couples therapist is that I get to sit in my office in my therapist chair and give advice to people and look as if I know exactly how to navigate a relationship perfectly successfully and smoothly. And the reality of my own marriage is a reality, right? I also struggle and have points at which I get stuck and where my spouse and I get stuck. And I think, just because you know how to understand other people's marriages doesn't make it simple to navigate your own. Relationships are so complicated. And I think, once you add children into the mix, it becomes that much more complicated. And I think, hopefully it's not disheartening to know that even therapists who are especially trained in this kind of thing, also struggle. Hopefully it just normalizes the experience. We're all in it together, and that, there's some peace that can come with knowing that, it's just a challenging time and period in the life of a marriage, and that marriages themselves are complicated. And so you and I started talking about this topic through some of the work that I'm doing on work and family balance. And you had talked about the Gottman book, and I think I had told you about this book that I had started reading with this fantastic title called How Not to Hate Your Husband After Kids, which I think I bought it really for the title, but it was written by a journalist who was struggling in her marriage after having a baby, and she decided to use her journalism career and skill as a platform to understand the problems that she was experiencing, that she and her spouse were experiencing, and then use the information that she was able to gather to improve her marriage. And so she wrote this book as a very personal, detailed description of her struggle and the strategies that she and her spouse picked up to heal their marriage. And she talks about things, ranging from like the research on why relationships become so difficult after children arrive, different pieces of therapy that she used. She talks about interviewing an FBI hostage negotiator to develop some skills and how to take down her temper and give her husband some strategies to help calm her down when she would get really angry. And so it was a pretty interesting book, and I think it provides a lot of insight into some of the challenges and also some of the research that explains why this is so difficult for couples.
Yeah. Somehow the hostage negotiator thing seems fitting. I don't know. I just find that funny. Just quick side note, when I went to pick up that book at the library, my husband was with me, and he was a little amused that I was checking out a book called How Not to Hate Your Husband.
Yeah. I had that same experience where I was sitting in bed reading it, and my husband sort of gave me the eyebrow.
Like, huh.
He and I didn't talk about it too much. I just said it's for some research.
Yeah.
We left it at that.
Don't ask any questions. Yeah. Okay, well, let's start by talking about the problem here. Before we move into suggestions, we're going to kind of just do a lay of the land between these books we've been reading, just about what it is that's so challenging about this issue. Why is marriage so hard after young kids and babies sort of come into the mix? And so I wanted to just start by a statistic that I read in the Gottman book, Baby Makes Three, which is that he studied these couples. He's mostly known for just general sort of couples and marriage research, and he studies sort of what's the difference between couples who sort of thrive and do really well and couples who have problems, and he could kind of predict who's going to make it and who's not. But what he started to look at was how those people's sort of satisfaction within a marriage or a couple's relationship changes over time when babies come along. And 67% of couples become very unhappy with each other in the first year with a baby. So that's like a majority of couples who go through a time, at least temporarily, where they feel sort of marital dissatisfaction. And there's a number of factors that, in both of the books that we read that may be, a part of this issue.
That's right. Yeah. And I think one of the things that just can't be emphasized enough is the factor of sleep deprivation when you have a newborn, especially the mother, particularly in cases where the mother is nursing. Sleep deprivation is a factor, but the reality is it impacts fathers too. And certainly if it's a same-sex spouse, the same thing can happen, right? Where both partners are impacted by the baby waking up and having needs sort of every couple of hours. And a lack of sleep causes all sorts of physiological changes in your physiology. One of the things that happens, research has shown that the amygdala, which is the control center for emotion in the brain, becomes more reactive, whereas the rational prefrontal cortex portion of the brain, which typically is able to put things into context, is less able to do its job. And so there's these changes in the way that our brains are able to function that causes us to actually focus more on negative experiences and to feel and sometimes behave more irrationally. I can definitely relate to that one.
Yeah. I think most of us probably can just have personal experience how when you're sleep deprived, it just affects how you feel, your mood, your physical, how you're feeling physically. And so it's not a surprise that that's, that plays a role. Just people tend to get more irritable and grouchy and on top of that, not only are we kind of walking around with just less baseline sleep, we're also, there's just a lot to do. There's extra tasks when you have young kids, when you have a baby and even, kind of toddlers, preschoolers. There's extra work, there's extra laundry, there's extra dishes, there's a lot of direct child-oriented work. And so in the Gottman book, which I have right here in my hand, Gottman, they have a list of all the different kind of flip through and find it. They generated a list of like all the different household and baby related tasks that people have to kind of keep on top of when they have young kids. And so I can just, the dishes. So there's a whole list, things like taking out the garbage, making kids lunches, taking care of a crying baby, taking kids to school. I mean, it goes on. And actually what's so funny in the book is that he says they used to have a longer list that was over 600 items. And they would give this to these couples and be like, okay, sort of who does what, and are there things you can do to make this, streamline this or make this just more equal. But when people are given the 600 list, it just made everyone like so depressed that they stopped giving it to people. Because even just reading the list that's in the book, I'm like, oh my gosh, no wonder. Like, it's just a lot of work. And so on top of the sleep deprivation, people are overwhelmed. And sometimes both partners feel like they're working so hard and they feel underappreciated by each other because some of the work you do goes unnoticed, or, your partner might even notice but not say anything, which can just lead to this feeling of like, gosh, I did the dishes again and no one even cares, and there can also be certainly some inequality in how those household tasks are distributed, which can also, just be a source of frustration.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I always like to cite for the couples that I see this social psychology study that asked couples what % of the household tasks they take on. And inevitably the percentage would always add up to more than 100 because people always think that they're doing so much and often feel, as you said, underappreciated or sort of that their contributions are invisible. That's certainly a common problem for couples in general and more so for couples with very young children because, as you said, and Gottman's list suggests that there is just so much to do. Yeah. And then, there's also the issue of hormonal changes, particularly in women right after they've given birth, where their body's just been through so much, and that can really cause a lot of emotional upheavals. And then, of course, there's the identity and role transitions for both partners, for both parents, where, before they were spouses or partners and they, did a job or not. But now they have added to the mix of their identity this new parenting role. And sometimes that can really cause a lot of questioning about sort of what priority, each individual places on the parenting versus their other roles and sort of, questioning of values and questioning of your partner's value in terms of where on the priority list each role goes. And then, of course, there can be work upheaval, so shifts in either how much you're working, which, of course, can cause financial stress. So, for example, if one of the partners begins to work less or takes a parental leave or an unpaid parental leave, that can cause a lot of stress. Or if you go back to work, but you're feeling a lot of inner conflict about how much you're working versus how much you're able to engage in the parenting role, that can also cause a lot of sort of inner turmoil about your identity and also the balance of work and family, which, again, I think a lot about in terms of the impact that it has on individuals. And I think all of those things can really impact the relationship because we're sort of looking to our partner to help us figure it out or to make it easier. And sometimes they're going through the exact same thing at the same time and also looking for us to support them. And sometimes there just isn't enough support between the two people because there's so much stress and pressure and overwhelm.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's the rare person who doesn't grapple with some of those changes in their life and in their work-life balance and whatnot, and to be sort of going through that, but be so stressed out and you not even have some, the time to sit down and kind of talk it out in a really supportive way. It's just a lot. It's a lot to deal with. And I mean, I even think just financially, the stress of that, it's like, how are we going to pay for, this child? And a lot of people move. I didn't, but a lot of people, sort of realize that their housing arrangement isn't going to work out now that they have more family members. And so just whatever life transitions are coming up for people, I think that there's often sort of an inner struggle around that.
That's right.
And what tends to happen is you sort of take all of these different factors and probably more, and then at the same time, you just have less, as a couple, you have like less to offer each other emotionally. So you're going through all this, but you're just so tired and you're sort of like emotionally just exhausted anyway. And so those times to sort of sit down and connect and spend that sort of engaged time with each other, I mean, frankly, I think for most couples, it's just drastically reduced after children come into the picture. Not only that, but physically, like the physical connection also very frequently changes. It's just biologically sort of a fact that women, after childbirth, and especially if they're breastfeeding, their libido changes during that period. And, often, again, people are just so exhausted that there's less time to have sort of physical touch. Sexual or also just, regular touch tends to decline drastically during that period. And so that's another way in which people connect. And so both emotional and physical connection just kind of declines during that period.
Yep, that's absolutely right. And in Jancy Dunn's book, The How Not to Hate Your Husband After Kids, she cites Esther Perel, who talks about how women have a tendency to sort of direct a lot of their touch and sensual energy, not sexual, but sort of touch and intimate energy towards the baby. And that can be sort of a diversion of the energy that they used to direct towards their spouses. And that is something that the male spouse might feel pretty intently.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's like this little person has been sort of touching you and clinging to you all day. And so, at the end of the day, you're just like, I don't want to be touched right now.
I don't want to be touched anymore.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that, by the way, is true even with older children. I can speak to that from personal experience. Yeah. If you've been having small people hanging on you all day, at the end of the day, you just sort of don't want to be touched by anyone.
Right.
And that can be really hard on a relationship, because touch is one of the ways that we form bonds and feel connected to our partner. And one of the ways that relationships are sustained in really healthy fashions. And once that becomes less available, it does become a lot harder to feel that connection with your partner.
Yeah, we talked in our last episode on social connection about that sort of, oxytocin kind of feeling you get from touch and physical contact. And so it's an important bonding thing. And so when it's not happening, it kind of just affects how well you're sort of feeling that bond with each other.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so, I think that there are some unique frustrations in heterosexual relationships after babies arrive that are worth noting. So for women, I think there is a tendency, and research bears this out, that women continue to do more childcare hours, even when they're working similar hours as the male spouse. And so there can be a sense of inequality or imbalance in the relationship, because under the same working hours, women may be doing more of the childcare and more of the household work. So there's also some evidence that men tend to choose more of the leisure type tasks. So that means that they may choose to engage in more child play as opposed to doing things like taking out the garbage or doing the dishes, if there's kind of a choice between tasks. And then there's also evidence that women tend to take on more of the mental load, sort of this idea that there's like a checklist of, we need to make sure that the doctor appointments are scheduled, and that the, immunizations are up to date, and that the laundry is complete, and that there's, food for the week. That is something that women tend to take on more of, as well as the emotional load. Like, is my baby, feeling happy? Are their needs met? Are we sort of making sure that we're sort of attending to the emotional needs of our child? And husband's frustration, again, in the more traditional heterosexual couples, may be a little bit different. So they may be feeling replaced in terms of attention, again, because women are likely to devote their central attention to the newborns and not have as much available for their spouse. Men may feel controlled, micromanaged, criticized, or gatekept. So in a way, because women tend to be socialized, and maybe there's some biology that predisposes us to do this, we may have more strong opinions about how parenting should be done, about how the house should be kept. That one's definitely socially derived, I think. But because of those opinions and our tendency to sort of feel like there's a way that we'd like to have it done, and because we are often the default sort of more domestic manager, it may sort of put the husband in a position of feeling like whenever they make an effort to make a contribution, that they get told that they're not doing it right, or otherwise told, that they're flawed in the way that they're making their attempt. And that can really de-incentivize their contributions and then make them less skilled and less motivated, which of course feeds into a dynamic as well.
Well, I think that's important to keep in mind. Like, I know I'm always reading, it's just my interest, I'm always reading about child development and different books on, young kids, and so I'll forward him like articles or something like that. And I think I'm being helpful, but I think he might feel like I'm criticizing, oh, well, you're doing this wrong or that wrong, or like I'm the expert and you're not, kind of thing. And so I think it can be kind of subtle, but that it is an important thing to look out for, is, are you, putting this standard on your partner and as if your way of doing things is right and they're wrong, and think about how that feels. I know I don't like being told I'm doing things wrong, so it's a slippery thing.
Yeah, I think that is such a great point that I think there is actually a tendency for women, for mothers, to be more interested in that kind of literature and sort of exploring like the right ways or the best ways to do things. And, I think for social reasons and just natural interest reasons, husbands and fathers may be less inclined to do that. And then they develop their own ways that feel more natural. And I think one of the things that I sort of focus on with the couples that I work with is that, looking to the experts is one great way to find out information, but it doesn't mean that using your natural inclination and your natural style as a parent is the wrong way. It's just a different way. And the reality is both have pros and both have cons. And so we'll talk a little bit about this in the strategy section, in the tips section of this podcast episode. But I think that just remembering that each approach to parenting has pros and cons can help in the sense of wanting to control or sort of manage the way that your partner parents, because it can allow you to say, okay, well, the way that they're approaching this is different than mine, but it probably has benefits for the child and for their relationship compared to mine, right? And I'll offer different things, and hopefully we can find a way to magnify the benefits that each of our approaches brings to the table.
Well, yeah, and I think even if you look closely at the field, it's not like there's one right answer and everybody knows it and everything else is wrong. Over time, perspectives change, and different, depending on who you read, you'll get different ideas. So it's just really important to keep in mind that it's a lot more, it's not like a black and white, right and wrong kind of thing with a lot of this stuff. So that might just allow a little bit of room for your partner's perspective if it's different from your own.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So, and I think that all just kind of gets to this idea that, it's really important for spouses to just, give space for their partner to have a valid approach, a valid perspective, a valid sort of reason to value or to deprioritize something that may matter more or less to the other person. So, this is kind of the last point about things that husbands may feel frustrated about, is that they may get a sense that their perspective is invalidated or met with contempt or hostility by their spouse, and that can be, one of the things that really contributes to a diminishing marital happiness experience for both people.
Absolutely.
And then the Dunn book actually talks a lot, just in terms of motivation to work on your marriage, about the importance of a happy marriage for children. So infants as young as 6 months old have been found to react negatively to argumentative voices. Babies raised by unhappily married parents are more likely to have developmental problems, and that ranges from potty training issues to difficulty self-soothing. Later, from ages about 6 to 8, the children raised with in unhappy marriages, in households with unhappy marriages, may assume that they're the cause of the fight. Even later, kindergarten and on in elementary school, they are more likely to develop things like anxiety and depression. And I think that just really can provide some motivation, and certainly provided Jancy Dunn, the author, with motivation to work on the marriage, because if you're not doing it for yourself, it is really important to do it for your children. And I just want to say too that the cure is not to not fight with your spouse, because fighting is a part of healthy relationships, right? You're not married to yourself, so you're going to not see eye to eye from time to time, probably more often than not. But what is important is to find ways to fight in healthy and productive styles with your spouse. And it's important not for your child to never see you fight, but to see a good model of what does it look like for two loving people who are respectful to disagree, and to do it in a way that is productive and not necessarily kind all the time, but respectful and healthy. Yeah. So that's kind of the point of this.
Yeah, and we have some concrete suggestions about ways that you can basically improve how you fight with each other. And certainly there's some people who go a lot more into depth about this. Gottman's book is really great for that. And if you want some motivation, I think along the same lines of what you were saying, there's a quote that comes up in the Gottman book: "The greatest gift you can give your baby is a happy and strong relationship between the two of you." So it may be worth working on some of these things, just because that's something really important to do for your children.
The first tip that we thought was important is to just keep some perspective. I mean, I think for me this is really useful. I'm sort of just turning the corner on the first year of my third baby's life, and 3 children, and I do know that, it is, the sleep deprivation at least is temporary, and that's helpful to know that, some of the things that are especially hard are temporary and will at some point in the near future, then it feels like it is, will be in the rear view mirror. And sometimes it is really just helpful to remember that.
Yeah, Gottman says we're all in the same soup. I think it's helpful to recognize that some of this is just like part of the normal process at this phase that will get better. A lot of it will. Maybe not all of it. Okay, suggestion and strategy number 2 is fight better. So this is a little bit of a long one. I'm going to talk about a couple things that came out of the Gottman book. And again, just remember that you're teaching your kids when they are observing what you're doing, especially as they get older, like they're paying attention. And it's really important to keep your values in mind, to remember that, you care about being a good parent. You probably care about your spouse, even if you may have forgotten. And that kids benefit from knowing that people can fight and still love each other. So Gottman talks about 4 really problematic ways that people can disagree in a couple relationship. So when you get into criticism, just really like attacking the other person in the couple, defensiveness, like where you just won't hear any possibility that you sort of shut down around any piece of your role in the situation. Stonewalling, where you just like do the silent treatment or shut the person out or just don't even, talk or open up at all. And then contempt. And actually contempt, I think, is the worst one. And that's basically when you just get really like mean, when you attack the other person, when you get really sarcastic and just sort of mean and nasty. And so those are his sort of 4 most problematic behaviors. And so a good place to start would be to notice, if you're doing criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, or contempt, try to figure out a different way to relate, because those are all super unhelpful for your relationship. He also recommends a softer start. So when you have a problem in your relationship, a lot of times we're like right in the heat of the moment and we just go for the jugular just right then and there, and it can just lead to a really big escalation. And so Gottman recommends, first of all, just timing it better and just starting in a gentle way. Honey, there's something I really wanted to talk to you about. There's something that, I'm not terribly thrilled with right at the moment, or, even using a little bit of humor, or just starting in a gentle way. Because I think when you start with an attack, it tends to make the situation so much worse. So think about how you start raising these issues and just work on that. Similarly, cool down conflict. So taking time to kind of regulate your emotions, take a break if you need to, just approach it from a place where you're not in this super heated, like very, very emotionally charged place where it's just going to be really hard to have a sort of calm, respectful conversation. You might need to just soothe, kind of regulate your own emotions a little bit first. And make a repair effort if you said or done something hurtful. So a repair effort is like, the classic example, of course, is to say, I'm sorry, or to sort of acknowledge that you did something, or to like reach out in a loving way to the person. So a repair effort is a way to sort of acknowledge and just sort of own your piece of it, or extend the olive branch to your partner. And really, it can go a long way toward improving the situation. It can keep you from like staying mad for a long time to kind of like working toward figuring out a solution. So make repair efforts when you need to. And then finally, we've already kind of said this, but it's so important, is to really try to understand your partner's perspective, that there are many valid points of view. I think there's some research that wives feel better when their husbands make an effort to understand why they're upset. So more so than husbands for some reason. But the perception of making an effort seems to really just make a big difference. So just keeping in mind that there's multiple points of view, and instead of focusing on convincing the other person that you're right, focus more on trying to understand where they're coming from.
Yeah. And what I often tell couples on that front is to just focus on effectiveness, because even if you're sort of really angry, we all get angry with our spouses. If we want something for our spouse, if we can just kind of pause and just say, well, if there's something I want, what's the best strategy to get it?
Right.
Usually coming hard at your partner is not the best way. It may sort of provide a release of all that angry energy, but ultimately it's not going to get you what you want. You're not going to get heard. You're not going to make an impact or sort of increase the likelihood of being understood or of getting any sort of practical thing that you're really longing for in that moment. Instead, when we sort of come hard at our partner, they're more likely to dig their heels in, to become defensive, or to stonewall us, or to attack back. And that really makes it a lot less likely that we are going to get what we want.
Right.
And
so strategically, it works better too, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And it can be really hard to sort of pause when we're, again, sleep deprived and going through all these things. And I think that's a part of what makes it so hard when you have very young children, is even just that moment of pausing and saying, okay, wait, what am I trying to do here? Can be really hard to access because we're just not thinking straight because we're so exhausted.
Right. And it's hard to find those moments to just kind of, chill out. Well, and for anyone who wants to learn more about these strategies, I really do recommend, it's the bulk of this book, Baby Makes Three. So I'd recommend kind of maybe checking that out if you want to really work on these skills. He goes a bit deeper into these areas.
Yeah, so useful. And then I'll sort of suggest another set of communication skills, which Jancy Dunn goes into. So she actually diagnoses herself as somebody who really comes at her husband with a lot of contempt, a lot of sarcasm. She actually goes to see a therapist at one point in the book, and he tells her that she's verbally abusive. And so she really took the idea of improving her communication strategies very seriously. And at one point, she sort of gets this idea of, wouldn't it be useful if my husband had some hostage negotiator skills to help sort of diffuse my anger? And so she ended up interviewing an FBI hostage negotiator, and he walked her through some of the strategies that they use, and she employs them to great effect. So the 5 steps of a hostage negotiator are active listening, showing empathy, building rapport, gaining influence, and then making a movement towards behavior change. And so the contrast of those strategies would be the ineffective approaches of intimidating, demeaning, lecturing, criticizing, or evaluating. Those are sort of the kinds of things that would set you up to, as a hostage negotiator, to just kind of put the terrorist or whoever on the defense and have them be really inflexible to working with you. But in terms of active listening, and I think the Gottman book also goes into this in some more detail, but this idea of active listening, which is really a powerful piece of communication, is paraphrasing what your partner is saying, doing some emotion labeling. So instead of sort of responding from your own perspective, sort of reflecting like, oh, it sounds as though you're feeling sad or frustrated or even angry, offering minimal encouragement. So, tell me more. Mirroring, so kind of reflecting back what it is that they're telling you, using open-ended questions, using I messages, and then allowing effective pauses. So really kind of staying in the listener mode can be really helpful if your partner is angry to diffuse their anger. And what I also often talk to couples about is sort of to really stay in the discussion mode and not get into problem solving, because that discussion mode is really where you can help take your partner's negative emotion down a little bit. If somebody feels heard, if they're feeling angry or hurt or disappointed, feeling heard and understood can really help them feel a lot better, right? It doesn't fix anything, but being understood, there's something so powerfully healing about that process. And that's really what therapy is about. So we certainly know that from our experience as therapists, but that can really be helpful in a conflict with your spouse as well. So don't score keep. That's really important not to score keep.
Oh, but it's so tempting.
I know it's so tempting.
I unloaded the dishwasher X number of times, right?
Totally. I mean, I think scorekeeping is exactly why there are so many arguments about division of household labor duties. It's so impossible to stay away from. But I think just in terms of effectiveness, it doesn't really get you what you want. No. I mean, I think talking more directly with your spouse about what it is that you'd like to do or to have them do is more effective than sort of going at them with I did more than you did and trying to prove your point in that way. But I'm guilty of that too.
Or if you do scorekeep in your own head, just keep that to yourself.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Bite your tongue. A lot of marriage is about biting your tongue.
Yeah.
Actually, my husband tells me that. If that tells you anything about how I approach it. And then Gottman also talks about, sharing your hidden soft emotions. So not just the anger, but often anger is a secondary emotion to hurt. So sharing the primary emotion of feeling hurt, devalued or sort of ignored, that those can be sort of the softer emotions. State your need clearly, and then also accept influence and compromise. I think that this is a big part of where spouses get stuck, is that we get kind of into this mode of, well, I know the way that we can do better. It would be if you did X, Y, or Z, as opposed to saying, this is upsetting. How can we figure this out together in a way that sort of honors what I'm telling you is bothering me, but also that honors that you have your own perspective and your own needs in this exact scenario. So I think that being willing to accept your spouse's influence and being willing to compromise is really critically important to getting through a difficult conflict. And then if you're deadlocked, which certainly happens and happens to everyone, take a break. Make sure that if you take a time out, that you make a time back in, so that the person who's really upset or both people who are really upset don't feel like they've been abandoned or prohibited from sharing what it is that they're feeling or thinking. And then during that break, try not to ruminate about what a terrible person you're. It can be really difficult not to get stuck in this narrative about your partner that just really demonizes them. Try to remind yourself that your partner is a good person and try to shift your attention to something calming, meditation, going for a walk, going shopping, whatever it is that can just calm you down. And so when you return to the conversation after your time out, that you're sort of in a place where you are willing to kind of engage in a positive fashion.
Yeah, that may be more helpful than just going through your mind about all the terrible fantasies you're having about what you'd like to do to this person when you're angry.
Or like the fantasies about like how they don't care about how you feel, or they don't bother to try, right? So I find myself, and I certainly know this from the couples that I see, that it's just so easy to get stuck in this like storyline about like what a terrible person your partner is when we're upset with them.
Yeah, definitely. So there were I think we just talked about the sort of fighting better and the communication tools, and there were so many like suggestions within a suggestion. I want to just say, like, these suggestions take a lot of practice, and especially if some of this is newer behavior. And so just to recognize that it might take a little bit more work than just listening to this podcast in terms of, maybe just trying this stuff out. It's easier said than done. So we went through it pretty quickly, but, it could be something that's worth putting a little bit of effort into, especially if some of these really stand out as like, oh yeah, that's a problem for me.
Yeah.
Okay. So tip 4, make housework work. There's no like simple, easy answer to this. Believe me. I mean, this is something we struggle with in my household, but, just trying to figure out something that feels fair. And there's a quote, equitable doesn't mean equal. It just means fair. Like just trying to compromise or figure out something workable. There's some research that couples with young children who more evenly split housework have better sex lives, and children who do better in school and are less likely to need psychiatric intervention. So there's some benefits for kids and for couples when there's some sort of fair arrangement. And, again, this isn't easy, and it may look different in different households, but a couple things to do are to look at, a list like the one Gottman has, or generate your own, and just say, kind of try to figure out who's going to do what, and help people find things that they sort of prefer to do, just to make the split work. But sometimes actually you have to realize that your standards may need to loosen up a little bit. I think this can be especially true when the standards are different and one partner has really, like, wants things done a certain way and maybe has some perfectionism or higher standards of cleanliness. It may not be worth the damage to the relationship to kind of keep things a certain way. You might have to just let some things go and do less, and just realize that, again, this is a situation where there's not necessarily a right or wrong. Like whether you clean the bathroom every other day versus once every 6 months, like those are just different standards of cleanliness. And, again, you may need to find a middle ground, and you may need to just recognize that there's no right or wrong. Just figure out something that works.
Yeah, I can think of so many examples of this because my husband is really good about being more low-key about various things, but I used to sort of have this idea like our children needed to be bathed every night, and we used to argue about it all the time. It was, I would feel like the kids were so grimy, and he would say, you're crazy. They do not need to be bathed every night. They are small children, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of resources to bathe them every night. We now have 3 children, and so, slowly over time, I accepted his influence, and we now bathe the children 2 or 3 times a week on an average week, and it's sometimes less, and it has been okay, right? They're sometimes a little grimier than I ideally would want, but if I don't let myself get bothered by it, it's actually not such a big deal. And there's so many examples like that in my relationship, some that I've handled better than others, where the difference in our style or our standards it feels vast, but when I'm willing to accept influence and compromise, it turns out not to be so bad. It's just a different preference. And if I'm willing to let it go and see the value in the way that he does things differently, it can go a lot better. And vice versa, of course. It helps when he also accepts my influence as well.
Yeah. Well, and I know for myself, sometimes what I do is I start doing all this stuff that I feel, oh, we need to do this and that and this and that. And then I'm like mad at him because I'm like, well, I did all this stuff and you didn't. And it's like, okay, I kind of took that on myself and nobody forced me. So, if I'm going to take on all this extra, housework or whatever, then that's my choice to do so. But I think I put that expectation on myself. So, just to realize that maybe a better approach would be to either not do it or to recognize that that's my choice. And if I want to do it, fine. But it's, it's not really fair to blame someone else for something that I did.
Right. And so that's the idea of letting some things go, which I think is really hard. And I certainly experience that a lot myself, where I feel like I wish I cared about fewer things.
Right.
So it sort of becomes my own challenge. But that actually is not my partner's fault. It's not his fault that I want an ambitious career, and I want a clean house, and I want to essentially be a full-time parent, right? That's not his fault.
Right.
It does make me tired and cranky sometimes because I just sort of reach the end of my limit, but there are choices that I can make that he can be helpful, but it's not ultimately up to him. And so I think that what you're saying is so resonant with me in terms of saying it's my values and it's my choices, and certainly I want him to help, but ultimately he's not at fault if there's a lot of things that I want to do or that matter to me.
Yeah. See, we're all in the same soup, right?
We're all in the same soup, yeah. So the next tip on here is to streamline decision making. So this is kind of just a way of lightening the load. So there's this concept in psychology called decision fatigue, where every time we need to sort of decide whether we're going to do or not do something, it taxes us cognitively. And so anything that you can make automatic just eliminates that level of cognitive load that you take on. So how most of us, hopefully, just automatically brush our teeth every day. We don't have to think about it. We just do it. It's a task that takes some energy, but it takes so much less energy because we've made it just kind of a habit. So anything that you can make a habit reduces the amount of energy that you have to devote to it. So things like making the lunches, or even I think when it comes to housework, just making automatic, like who does what, can in a way that feels fair enough for the two of you, can be really helpful. So if your partner sort of just is in charge of the children's laundry, and you can be in charge of doing the dishes, or you can even sort of designate certain days of the week that you're in charge of various things, but make it automatic so that you don't have to negotiate it every time the decision comes up with your partner.
Oh
and
man, that
really
sounds nice.
Yeah.
That's a good
takes some planning.
Yeah.
And then the next tip is to recognize the unhelpful story. So this is, again, and I mentioned this earlier, but I think it can't be emphasized enough, is sort of the role that our narrative, the narrative that we get sucked into when we're upset with our spouse, can play in how we engage with them, how that conflict can look and can play out. So, recognize that your mind comes up with stories to explain why you're unhappy. And this is, I think, really important when we think about just the physical toll that having young children takes. So if you're tired, if you're worn out, if you're stressed out, if you're going through hormonal changes, you're feeling pretty physically uncomfortable. And one of the things that your mind does is it tries to come up with a reason. And our partner can become the explanation, right? Because they're an easy target, right? They're not our innocent, angelic newborn. And also because we often look to our partner to kind of help us feel better. And so if we're not able to feel better, even for reasons that have nothing to do with our partner, our mind may explain that our partner is the cause. And one of the things that I think is really interesting, and this comes from research out of Jonathan Haidt's lab. He's actually a social psychologist who studies morality, but he has this wonderful metaphor called the elephant and the rider, where he talks about how the elephant is our gut intuition, is kind of the source of our feelings and our beliefs at sort of a gut, non-logical level. And we often think that the rider of the elephant is in charge, sort of our rational, strategic, logical thinking, but it's actually the elephant who's more in charge. Our feelings, our gut intuition, and our strategic reasoning follows. So we feel something, and then we rationalize why we feel it. We find a reason for why we feel it. And I think for a lot of couples with young children who are dealing with all these physical discomforts and sort of stressors, it's really easy for our mind to just land on, oh, it's our partner, of course. And that
it's all your fault.
Right. So allow yourself to look for some disconfirming evidence for that, and to kind of realize that it is a hard time and that your partner is likely not the cause, even if your mind wants to create that story because it's sort of a simple, clever, and interesting story, right? Which is those are the stories that we get caught up with.
Yeah, it's a good thing to be aware of if you're kind of taking all of everything and sort of blaming it on your partner or targeting them as the cause. It's like, maybe let's look at some other things going on, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So our next tip, this is tip number 7, learn to live with it. So this one is this came from the Gottman book too. This is about just sort of recognizing that in every couple there are certain issues that will never go away. You're never going to resolve some of this stuff. So there's a list actually of perpetual issues in the Gottman book, like differences in cleanliness, differences in how of sort of emotional expression, differences in how, optimal sexual frequency, like one person wants more physical contact than the other, differences in approaching finances, differences in parenting approaches. I mean, there's so many things on this list. And I think one thing that we can get sort of caught up in is believing that we have to like fix this stuff. When in fact, sometimes it's just sort of a fundamental difference that's just going to be there. And so one thing that can be helpful to consider is that maybe not to say that you shouldn't ever talk about it or that you shouldn't work it out, but that you should at some level at least just sort of accept that you and your partner aren't going to be the same in terms of all of these things. And instead of trying to focus on fixing something that can't be fixed, just figure out a way to make it work and just sort of have some acceptance. This is going to be sort of an ongoing thing. And I think that can help you just sort of loosen your grip on this desire to solve it or fix it. Might be there, might have been there 10 years ago. It might be there 10 years from now. And if you can just sort of recognize that, then maybe you can just kind of have a little bit more acceptance.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way that I often talk to couples about this issue, this sort of idea of like there being irreconcilable differences between the two of you, is that couples who approach that difference as a team. So like, okay, it's us versus that difference. And the solution is really, how do we as a team manage the fact that we feel differently about this, or that we approach this differently, or we have different preferences? Then it can actually be a bridge to feeling more connected, as opposed to something that feels divisive between the two of you. And taking that team approach can really help you feel like you're managing it instead of allowing it to sort of create conflict between you two. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that there's a lot of research to back up, and this was actually something that I focused some of my graduate research on, is this idea of positive illusions. So the ability to overlook what we don't like about our partners is actually one of the things that predicts happy relationships. And so, I think that we are often controlled by our minds, but we don't have to be all the time, right? We have some influence over what we allow our minds to think about and what we sort of decide we're going to redirect our attention. And I think that knowing that it doesn't really help to sort of perseverate on something you don't like about your partner can be helpful, right? Because you could say, well, it is what it is. I'm going to think about something else. For example, some of the things that I really love about my partner. And there's this great quote by Ben Franklin, which is, keep your eyes wide open before marriage and half shut afterward. And I think that that's really useful, right? There are some things that are just core to who your partner is. They're not going to change. Harping on them makes them feel bad, makes you frustrated. It is more useful instead to focus on the things that you like and sort of try to direct away from the things that bother you.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to try that. Eyes half shut. I'm just going to ignore certain things. Yeah.
And then touch and talk. So we talked a bit about how there's a change in couple sex lives after the arrival of small people. And I think that one of the important things is just to accept that things might be different for a while. The libido drop is normal, biologically based. If the wife is breastfeeding, certainly the lack of sleep and the heightened feeling of stress can impact both people's libido. If there is one partner who wants to continue to have sex at the same rate as you were having sex before children, I think, having conversations about it using the communication tips above can be really important. Be willing to include non-sexual physical contact. I mean, that can actually be a bridge to increasing sexual intimacy anyway. And even in the absence of sexual intimacy, that non-sexual physical touch can promote bonding, as you were saying, with the oxytocin release. In sort of a biological way, and certainly in an experiential way, it can be really helpful. And one of the other things that I talk a lot with couples about is sort of expanding the definition of sexual intimacy during that first year of having a new child in your life when the libido is low. So, thinking about things other than sexual intercourse as ways to be sexually intimate with one another if it feels like intercourse just feels off the table for, a time, for example, when the wife is breastfeeding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I think even sometimes that type of non-sexual touch can feel like it takes some effort, because, again, we talked about sometimes you're just tired of being touched and you just have nothing left to give. But, those little things can make a difference. Just a hug or a cuddle or a hand holding or something like that. So trying to make that effort here and there might be worthwhile. Okay, so one more tip, engage dads. So there's a lot of research about the importance of dads being involved with the family, with the kids. This is kind of assuming a heterosexual couple, but it could also apply to same-sex couples. Dads sometimes have like a different role in terms of how they play with the kids and how they interact with the kids and in terms of sort of their role to the family. But I do think that piece about that you mentioned earlier, Yael, about how sometimes dads feel sort of shut out. And so if you can find a way, whatever it looks like in your particular arrangement, for the dad to get more involved, it just has a lot of benefits for everyone. So part of it is just, kind of allowing the fathers to be themselves and to be engaged as much as possible. And sometimes I think that, in a heterosexual couple where there's some gender roles at play, that can involve, certain like things that tend to default to the mom or standards where it's like, I want things done a certain way. It's like, just let go of that and get the father in as much as possible. So like moms, I think, sometimes feel uncomfortable with those little baby periods with the little babies, just leaving and allowing the father to do things like, what if he forgets a snack, or what if he doesn't bring a change of clothes, or what if he does the nap 2 hours later than I do. And I get that can be really hard, but sometimes that can be like the best thing to help the father just figure it out for himself.
Yeah, and one of the things that I like to think about is just the skill-based piece of it, is that when mothers do this sort of, it has to be this way, and if it's the other way, then that could be a disaster, and that ends up shutting out the father. It can really prevent skills from being built. Like,
exactly.
Mothers too have a learning curve, and we just, especially in these sort of more traditional heterosexual couple, especially if the mother is nursing, right, the learning curve happens earlier. There's a lot of one-on-one contact between the mother and the baby in those early months that the father may have less of. And so, they're going to have to go through their own learning curve, and it is sort of up to the mother, the wife, to make space for that to happen in a non-criticizing, non-sort of damning way, because otherwise it becomes very uncomfortable to sort of feel like you're being observed and judged and criticized as you're going through a learning process. I mean, if we can put ourselves in that position, it would sort of make us say, well, no thanks, I'd prefer to just stay over here and do my own thing. But it does, it requires us to say, if it's done not my way, or if it's done even in a way that objectively I don't prefer, it really is okay. And oftentimes, we sort of have this narrative, and I'm using the word narrative so much, but our minds tell us things like, it could never happen that way, or if I wasn't there, my child wouldn't eat, or if that diaper gets put on backwards, it's going to be an absolute disaster. It may not be ideal, but it probably will be okay. And I think that we need to sort of correct our minds from these catastrophic conclusions that we come to if it's not done the exact way that we want.
Kids have survived worse things than, mismatched clothes and a late nap. So, perspective taking can be handy there too. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think the final thing is just to remember to turn toward each other, turn toward each other in friendship, with humor, be in it together. Think about it. In the military, they sometimes have a friend that you call a battle buddy, and going through life with young children can feel like that sometimes. But try to turn toward each other instead of on each other. Think of your partner as your teammate, even if you don't see things exactly the same way. It is okay to not see things exactly the same way as your teammate, but you're still a teammate when it comes down to it.
Yeah, and I think humor can go a long way. Like my husband and and I. So the song we danced to at our wedding, which I'll spare you my singing voice, but do you know that song, La Vie en Rose? Mm-hmm. Give your heart and soul to me, and life will always be La Vie en Rose. So we'll look at each other at these moments when we're like up to our elbows in a poopy diaper, and there's like a screaming toddler in the other room, and we'll look at each other and be like, is this what they meant by La Vie en Rose? You know, because like it's almost like you have to like join each other in the absurdity of it all to some degree, to be like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe we're doing this. But if it feels like you're doing it together with a little bit of humor, and then also savoring those moments, I think, when it's like you're seeing your kid do something awesome and amazing, and you're just like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. Those are moments that you can actually connect if you do turn toward each other.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we're sort of talking about like the first year, the younger years of having children is so difficult and painful. And that is true, but it is also true that they are hilarious and so fun and so full of joy and meaning. And so if you can find ways to get through the difficult moments and, as you said, savor the joyful, funny ones together, and, you know, that can be so bonding and so fun, and you know, such a gift to have a partner to go through that experience with.
And you don't want to lose that. I mean, that's an important thing, and I think it can get lost in the hard stuff. Yeah.
It can, and it does. I mean, it can get lost without some effort to nourish it, and I think that it can be hard to find the resources to nourish it. But it is important to try to find moments where there are some resources available, even if they're very small, and direct them towards your relationship. So, you know, one of the examples that Gottman gives is that happy couples regularly respond to one another's bids for connection. So, you know, if your partner is reaching out, you know, respond favorably, even if you're feeling really tired. I mean, you can even say, you know, I'm not in the mood to have sex tonight, but I do love you so much. You know, you can sort of respond favorably to a bid for connection or attention from your partner without dishonoring your own needs, but to sort of, you know, provide some loving response to them, even if you're feeling low on resources.
Yeah, just a small amount of that can go a long way, though. Just a little bit of room for attention and connection. Yep. Well, thank you so much, Yael. This has been really a fun topic, and I think actually I'm going to, you know, keep some of these things in consideration, and I hope that's true for our listeners as well. And thank you very, very much.
Oh, it was such a pleasure. This is one of my favorite topics.
Yeah, it's a good one. All right, take care.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and iTunes. You can also find us at www.offtheclockpsych.com. That's offtheclock, PSYCH.com. Music by John Gu and Susie Stevens.